go. Hello, everyone. Before I begin, did anyone get a chance to see the string quintet play Reigns of Castamere at the start of this conference? Because if you didn't, you missed out. That was amazing. And Game of Thrones, of course, as well. So, yeah, unfortunately, I don't think I've got anything to offer right now that will quite compete with Game of Thrones on cellos, but we'll see. It's a pleasure to be here, first of all. Introductions, my name is John Davies. I'm also reading from a script, as you can probably tell, so apologies if I don't wander around the stage. I'm not quite so versed at presentations. I'm the narrative designer at Coatsink, the writer, in other words, where we develop, among many other things, story-driven titles for VR. The most recent of which was called Augmented Empire, which we launched in July, which I'm going to talk about predominantly today. This is a screenshot from the game. Augmented Empire is a cyberpunk RPG for Gear VR, as I say, in which the player assumes the role of a cybercriminal who sits in their secluded penthouse and commands a team via an augmented reality tabletop display. Now, all that sounds quite complicated, but just to break things down, outside the play area, you can see part of the room, this kind of blue wireframe. These are the characters that you control in the bottom right. We've got Willa, who's the main character. I'll talk about her at length. And you move your head and tap with a control similar to this one to interact with the world. Yeah, it came out 2 months ago to some pretty positive reviews. Players really like the art style and our spin on turn-based combat. Plus the story and voice acting was commented on a lot, which I was obviously thrilled about. So today, as the writer, I'm going to talk a bit about the creative process. Because on the surface, the setup, as I described, of Augmented Empire seems quite complicated. We have a fictional city with its own history and lore, a party of 6 to control, with their own personalities and agendas. We've got this warring gang, and the story is about a class system that you overthrow that controls the city. But all of this is actually window dressing. It's not what the story is about. The story is about a young girl figuring out who she can trust when everything she knows is stripped away. And that's really the secret. Simplicity. If you crack open the hood of Augmented Empire, you'll find a single protagonist with clear desires and needs who undergoes internal conflict and change in a 3-act structure. And it's that structure that I'm going to talk about today, with specific regard to something called the central crisis. What the crisis is, what it can add to gameplay, and how you might be able to apply some of the same principles in your own interactive stories. Because the central crisis really was the core around which the whole story was built. Now, a lot of this is storytelling 101, but I hope everyone takes at least one new thing. I've discovered in the past everyone can't really get enough of hearing about how stories are constructed, at least not for VR, so here we go. Okay, before we move into that, though, some considerations for creating a 10 to 12 hour RPG for virtual reality. Augmented Empire was designed to be played sat down, using a controller rather than the head-mounted touchpad, which you get with the Gear VR, using small and precise head movements. Missions were restricted to 20 to 30 minutes per mission. There's 26 missions altogether, with regular interim saves before, after combat, those sort of things. And missions are effectively story chapters, each ending on a cliffhanger, which gives the player an obvious exit point between play sessions and a short recap before your next mission. You've got an objective, quick recap on the story, and all these things. Now, the greatest issue for me as the writer was one of perspective. And I don't mean the player's view of the world, which we saw earlier in the screenshot, but the player's view of the character they inhabit. Because in most games, the player character is the protagonist of the story, because this puts the player at the forefront of the action and provides the most agency. You play the hero of the story. This is not the case in Augmented Empire. Here, the story's protagonist is an independent character that the player character sees and controls in the world, called Willa. There we go. She was the character that we saw in the bottom right of the diorama display earlier. She's the one we spend most of our time with, who we instruct and communicate with, and who develops the most during the story. Finally, we created a separate player voice character to do all the explaining. And this is a robot called Hartman. Hartman's a robot who floats around your penthouse apartment and speaks to you and speaks on your behalf to the team, rather. Again, because he's not the player, he's also able to provide instructions directly to you, the player, without it seeming forced or unnatural. So he, again, speaks to the team, says, Craven wishes you to do this, but can also provide you instructions and tutorials, being an external voice. OK, on to the writing process then. Context versus story. When it comes to game narrative, context and story are two very different things. All games require context. From 1962 Space War to Pong a decade later, context is the framing device that tells the player who they are and the objective of the game. You are fighting in Space War, you are playing tennis in Pong. Context is static. Once established, there's no further development other than the outcome of the game. So all games require context, but games do not necessarily require a story. Story is what happens to the characters of the game over the course of its telling, rather, as authored by the developers. It's also temporal. It has patterns and rhythms, and it develops over time. But most importantly, it involves moments of failure and defeat, which is a real sticking point, and we'll talk more about that later. On to the crisis. A story is built through conflict and reversals, from the dialogue within a scene to the major turning points at the end of each act. A useful illustration came from South Park's creators, Trey Parker and Matt Stone, who said, between every story beat should be the words therefore or but. It gives you the causation between each beat, and that gives you the story. So the start of Augmented Empire, to break it down, Willa's about to ascend to Celestia, but her mother shows up. Therefore, Willa protects her mother from the cops, but in doing so, she becomes an outlaw, and so on. The crisis, therefore, is the biggest reversal from success to defeat in the story. In other words, the biggest but. Structurally, the crisis occurs towards the end of Act 2, and it has several different names: the Central Crisis, the Great Ordeal, or the All is Lost moment, which I'm sure we're familiar with. Or more esoterically, the Descent into the Underworld, the Whiff of Death, and the Dark Before the Dawn. As these names imply, it's the moment in the story where the hero is brought closest to death. Either their own life is in danger, or perhaps a companion dies, or they're physically surrounded by death, and I'll show some examples of this later. And its function in the story is simple. This quote from Vogler at the bottom. The whole quote goes, the simple secret of the crisis is that heroes must die so they can be reborn. In some way in every story, heroes face death or something like it. Their greatest fears, the failure of an enterprise, the end of a relationship, or the death of an old personality, which they magically survive and are symbolically reborn to reap the consequences. They have passed the main test of being a hero. So here's some examples from films I hope you're all familiar with. Raiders of the Lost Ark, Jones and Marion are sealed in the Well of Souls. Star Wars, the team ends up trapped in the Death Star's trash compactor. This is a massively famous example. And Obi-Wan obviously forced Darth Vader at a similar moment. And the Fellowship of the Ring, the Balrog chases the Fellowship through the depths of Moria, and Gandalf falls into the abyss. And I'm sure for those of you who write your own stories, of which I hope there's quite a few, you'll likely intuit the necessity for a moment like this, even if you're not consciously aware of why it needs to occur. It's important to point out now that this is not the climax of the story, it's not the end. It's not the big fight or the final moment of character change at the end of the story. The crisis falls roughly between the halfway and two-thirds mark through the narrative. Now, when it comes to this moment of crisis, video games have a serious problem. Superficially, it seems stories and games are working towards the same end. They're both about overcoming challenge and hook us in with the question of success. Is our hero capable? Are we capable? Which would be fine if it wasn't for this business of character development. Now, to briefly explain, I'm going to rattle through this. Stories are fundamentally about a character overcoming internal conflict and changing. As McKee says, the story arcs or changes a character's inner nature. By the climax of the story, these changes have profoundly affected the humanity of the character. Without experiencing setback to know defeat, the hero can never experience the internal conflict necessary to change. So, why is the crisis important in this regard? Because it's the biggest moment of doubt. It's the moment the hero and the audience discover that, for all their abilities and plans, they have fallen short. They still have more to learn, further to go, and bigger changes to make. In other words, in stories, the hero must know defeat, but in games, the player must always succeed in order to progress. So the question then becomes, how do we introduce defeat to a medium that relies on continued success? Now, this in my mind is probably the greatest challenge when devising any story for any video game. Because it's this natural inclination towards constant progress that makes many video game narratives feel underwhelming. Our heroes are constantly achieving, they're constantly moving forward until they reach their goal, and we're left curiously unsatisfied by this, because that victory has not been earned in terms of the deeper character. So what can the Crisis do for gameplay? Here's a quote from Extra Credits. If you don't watch Extra Credits, watch Extra Credits. Change is the most powerful tool in game design. When a game changes, the experience it creates changes. As it modifies elements, new isolated and associated meanings are fed to the player. And this change, aptly timed, can synthesize story and gameplay. At the moment of crisis, the protagonist is at their most vulnerable, stripped of their weapons, magic, and equipment, and must rely on a deeper part of themselves to succeed. And it's this vulnerability that can bring story and gameplay together. You can allow the player to experience that failure, that proximity to death and vulnerability through the mechanics, settings, or both. And I'm going to hit up some examples right now, and hopefully you'll only see a pattern in terms of where these moments in these games fall, but also kind of think back if you've played them and go, oh yeah, that part was actually really cool. And as we go through them, keep in mind that line from Vogler, and I'll repeat it at the end, that the hero must face death at the moment of crisis so they can be reborn. So, Portal and Portal 2. Not VR games, but there we go. Using only your wits and the portal gun, you escape certain death at the hands of an evil AI. Respectively, this is the fire pit in Portal and the fall in Portal 2, pictured here. The change here is delivered through level design, mechanics, and tone. In both of these games, this is the part where you go off the grid. You're no longer in test chambers, you are behind the scenes instead, discovering new areas and mechanics for yourself. BioShock. Jack is forced to kill Andrew Ryan, spoilers, before being left to die. The gameplay change here is mechanical. After meeting Ryan, your plasmids go haywire and fire off randomly. You lose the mastery of the abilities that you've relied upon until now to survive. Metal Gear Solid 3. After escaping prison, Snake flees Grisnigrad before confronting the Sorrow. Now, there are numerous gameplay changes here. In captivity, you have no control. It's all cutscene, which is also something that occurs in Augmented Empire, which I'll go into shortly. Escaping, you're stripped of your camouflage and equipment and on the run. Then finally, facing the Sorrow, pictured here, you're forced to press forward through a ghostly river until you literally die. The player must then penetrate the mechanics and rules of the game in order to be reborn on the riverbank. And onto my personal favourites. This is obviously Ocarina of Time. Ocarina expresses the story moment of the crisis through theme. The Shadow Temple is full of underworld imagery, including a literal crossing of the River Styx on a boat. However, it's the bottom of the well where you're most vulnerable. You're a child stripped of your adult equipment, including the Master Sword. And no more is this vulnerability evident than when you fall through one of the illusory floors that litter this place, and you land in an earthy, grave-like pit where zombies lock you rigid, leap on your back, and nuzzle you to death. At that exact moment, our goal feels more distant than ever. We feel that despair, we participate in it, and we play through it to return to the lights. Not to go on, but here's another one from Ocarina of Time. Compare the imagery of the Shadow Temple to the Spirit Temple that follows. Visually and thematically, we're moving from a world of darkness and physical decay to one of light and resurrection. As Vogler says, we die so we can be reborn. So how is this principle applied to Augmented Empire? From inception, everything about the story of Augmented Empire, including Willa's character and her relationship with both her mother and the player character, served this pivotal story beat, this moment of crisis. We know from the start that Willa hates her mother, therefore, Craven lies about working with her. But when Willa finds out, pictured here, she turns against us, the player character, and at the worst possible moment. Everything that can go wrong does go wrong after this moment. The team disbands, Will is captured and taken to a prison deep beneath the city, and the bad guys are given all the power that we've been working to build. The kindly philanthropist inventor that we just met is killed in cold blood, and even our 3-point plan on display in our penthouse, which is, in the middle of the screen here. Build a team, hit the vault, and make the trade, which are our objectives from the very start of the game, are crossed out. The story feels like it's ended, and at the worst possible way for everyone involved, not least the player. Especially for our hero Willa, she's captured, she's powerless, and she's stripped of her weapons and teammates. I won't explain exactly how it's done, but all this is so we can take this journey with her, this crisis moment, from that sense of powerlessness and defeat in prison, and knowing that death is near in the mines. To watch her overcome and climb from the darkness and return reborn into the light. Renewed, restored, and having changed. But this isn't the end. This is only the start of the third and final act of our story, which we enter with renewed vigor and determination to finish what we started. In conclusion, if you're developing your own story, which I hope a few of you are, I hope this has provided a few new ideas. I'll quickly reiterate the main points just to finish. The crisis is the end of Act 2 all is lost moment. It can be used to disempower the player, blending story and gameplay, to then propel the player into the final stretch of the game. And even though the crisis is the backbone of every single story, for some reason, it has the power to surprise and thrill us every single time we see it. I'm John. Thank you very much for listening.
Yeah, and an excellent talk to Open XR University, so a big thank you to John. Do we have any questions from the audience? Yeah, we've got one there. We'll just get the microphone to you. Thanks.
Right, is this good?
Hello, yes.
So have you embraced this recipe for a story? Like this is the only or the best way to make a story, this 3-act recipe? Or don't you have a pressure to, or feel a pressure to reinvent the whole story arc in a better way? Or are you just content with this?
Content. Now, there are, even in my mind, probably about 5 or 6 different story structures. There's Christopher Booker's 7 basic plots. Vogler, which I talked about here, which I guess the majority of this material is taken from, which is like the hero's journey based on Campbell's The Hero with 1,000 Faces. No, Vogler called it the writer's journey. There's also Save the Cat, which everyone's familiar with, and all these things have certain things in common. There's common structural elements depending on what type of story you're trying to write, whether it's like a tragedy or a comedy. There's always a moment, I don't know, at the beginning where the hero is made aware of the quest they must follow. There's always this moment at the end where they either succeed or fail, depending on their ability to change as a character or if it's a tragedy. And there's always this kind of moment in the middle called the false defeat, or maybe the false success, or some kind of crisis moment where everything goes completely wrong. And it's not really a formula, it's just kind of a pattern that you see through many things. I mean, it's descriptive of the ways the best stories are told. It's not prescriptive of a way to tell stories. It's just, yeah, identifying a pattern more than anything.